There was one rule every navy in the world understood during the Second World War. You do not send escort carriers into a fleet battle, not against battleships, not against heavy cruisers, and certainly not against the Imperial Japanese Navy. Escort carriers were never designed for glory. They were small, slow, lightly armored ships built on merchant hulls and rushed into service because America needed aircraft at sea faster than shipyards could build full-sized fleet carriers. Sailors called them jeep carriers. Some officers called them disposable. A full fleet carrier could launch devastating strikes hundreds of miles away. An escort carrier struggled to make 19 knots on a good day. Their job was simple: protect convoys, hunt submarines, provide air cover for amphibious landings. They were not supposed to fight surface fleets, especially not the largest concentration of Japanese warships assembled since Midway. For decades, naval doctrine treated ships like these as secondary tools, useful, necessary, but expendable. Even the Japanese saw them that way. And then came October 25, 1944, a stretch of ocean east of the Philippines, a patch of water off Samar Island, and one impossible moment that shattered everything navies believed about courage, firepower, and survival at sea. Because on that morning, a handful of tiny American escort carriers and their escorts stood directly in the path of a Japanese fleet led by battleships so powerful they could destroy targets from more than 20 miles away, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, and somehow, the worthless carriers survived. The story begins in the Philippines. By late 1944, the Pacific War is turning against Japan with terrifying speed. American submarines are strangling Japanese shipping. U.S. carrier strikes are hammering airfields across the Pacific. Island after island has fallen. Now the Americans are returning to the Philippines. For General Douglas MacArthur, the invasion is personal. 2 years earlier, he had escaped Corregidor and promised, "I shall return." Now he has. More than 700 American ships pour into Leyte Gulf to support the landings. Troops storm beaches, supply ships unload tanks and ammunition, aircraft circle overhead continuously, and somewhere inside this enormous operation sits a tiny task group known as Taffy 3. Task Unit 77.4.3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, that is all. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commands the group from the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay. Sprague is 48 years old, calm, intelligent, methodical. Not the kind of officer who seeks attention. He understands exactly what escort carriers are designed to do and what they are not designed to do. His ships carry FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, aircraft meant for anti-submarine patrols and close air support. Many planes are loaded with machine gun ammunition and fragmentation bombs for ground targets, not armor-piercing weapons, not anti-ship torpedoes, nothing suitable for fighting battleships. The men aboard Taffy 3 know they are close to combat zones, but they believe the powerful American Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey is guarding the northern approaches. That assumption is about to collapse. Because while American commanders focus on decoy Japanese carriers to the north, another Japanese force is slipping through the San Bernardino Strait. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commands it, and it is monstrous. 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. More than 200,000 tons of warships moving through darkness toward the vulnerable American landing forces. Kurita's mission is simple: break into Leyte Gulf, destroy the invasion fleet, turn the beaches into a graveyard. At dawn on October 25th, Taffy 3 is operating east of Samar. The sea is relatively calm. Pilots prepare for routine support missions. Breakfast is being served aboard several ships. Then lookouts spot anti-aircraft fire on the horizon. Moments later, black shapes emerge through rain squalls, tall masts, pagoda towers, massive gun flashes. At first, some Americans cannot believe what they are seeing. Then radar confirms it. Japanese battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, coming directly toward them. Distance, roughly 17 miles. Too close. Far too close. On the bridge of Fanshawe Bay, Sprague immediately understands the disaster unfolding in front of him. His escort carriers are being hunted by ships specifically designed to annihilate weaker opponents, and there is nowhere to run. The Japanese fleet is faster, more heavily armed, better armored, and closing rapidly. One American sailor later describes the feeling as watching a pack of wolves charging into a flock of sheep. Then Yamato opens fire. You have to understand what that means. Yamato's main guns are 18.1 inches in diameter, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighs more than 3,000 pounds. The explosions rise around the American ships like apartment buildings erupting from the sea. Water crashes onto decks. Steel trembles. Men freeze for half a second as the impossible becomes real. Then the entire American formation erupts into motion. Sprague orders full speed, smoke screens, launch every aircraft immediately. Does not matter if they are armed properly. Get them airborne. Pilots sprint across carrier decks. Engines roar alive. Aircraft bounce down short escort carrier runways overloaded with fuel and improvised weapons. Some planes launch carrying only machine gun ammunition. Some carry depth charges. One pilot later jokes they would have attacked the Japanese fleet with pistols if necessary. Behind the carriers, American destroyers begin laying smoke. USS Johnston, USS Hole, USS Hirman. Tiny ships compared to what approaches them, and aboard Johnston stands one of the most aggressive naval officers in American history, Commander Ernest Evans, part Cherokee, fiercely independent, known for profanity, courage, and absolute refusal to back down. Before taking command of Johnston, Evans told his crew one thing: this is going to be a fighting ship. Now that promise is about to be tested against impossible odds. The Japanese fleet keeps advancing, 16 miles, 15, 14. Heavy cruiser shells begin crashing dangerously close to the carriers. Splinters slice through exposed sailors. One shell lands near White Plains and throws columns of water across the flight deck. Another explodes beside Kalinin Bay. Japanese spotters can barely believe what they are seeing. Escort carriers, tiny carriers, practically defenseless. Kurita believes he has trapped part of America's main carrier fleet. He orders aggressive pursuit. And then something happens that no Japanese commander expects. The destroyers charge directly at them. Johnston accelerates into the smoke, 34 knots, straight toward battleships, straight toward heavy cruisers. Think about the scale difference. Johnston displaces around 2,100 tons. Yamato displaces more than 70,000. This is not bravery anymore. This is insanity. Evans orders torpedoes prepared. Japanese shells begin straddling the destroyer almost immediately. Orange flashes, steel screams. The ship shudders violently. One hit tears through the deck, another destroys gun mounts. Sailors die instantly. But Johnston keeps charging. 10,000 yards, 9,000, 8,000. Evans waits. Japanese ships fill the horizon now, towering gray walls of steel emerging through smoke and shell splashes. 7,000 yards, 6,000. Evans gives the order. Fire torpedoes. 10 torpedoes leap into the sea. White wakes streak toward the Japanese line. Moments later, heavy cruiser Kumano is ripped apart by explosions that blow off her bow. The Japanese formation begins maneuvering violently. For the first time that morning, the attackers hesitate, and that hesitation matters. Because every minute Taffy 3 survives is another minute American forces in Leyte Gulf avoid catastrophe. Meanwhile, the escort carriers are fighting for their lives. Pilots attack repeatedly despite lacking proper weapons. Wildcats strafe destroyers. Avengers make fake torpedo runs just to force Japanese ships to maneuver. Machine guns chatter. Bombs explode harmlessly against armor but create confusion. Japanese gunners struggle to track targets through smoke squalls, aircraft attacks, and constant evasive maneuvers. The battlefield becomes chaos. Rain, smoke, explosions, radio transmissions overlapping in panic. One moment Japanese shells smash into the ocean around the carriers. The next moment, American planes dive out of clouds, firing everything they have. Then comes one of the most unbelievable scenes in naval history. Escort carrier Gambier Bay begins falling behind. Japanese cruiser fire tears into her hull, shells punch through thin armor, fires erupt below deck. The ship slows. Crewmen watch Japanese warships gaining steadily behind them. A battleship firing at an escort carrier, like a lion hunting a rabbit. And still the Americans refuse to surrender. Destroyers keep attacking. USS Hole charges directly into overwhelming fire and is shattered by repeated hits. Shells rip through engine rooms. The bridge becomes a slaughterhouse, yet the ship continues firing until nearly destroyed. USS Samuel B. Roberts, technically only a destroyer escort, joins the fight too. Its captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, tells his crew, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Then Roberts attacks anyway. The tiny ship fires so rapidly that crews overheat the gun barrels. At one point, Roberts closes within 4,000 yards of Japanese heavy cruisers and launches torpedoes almost point blank. Japanese sailors later described the American resistance as unbelievably aggressive. They cannot understand it. These ships are supposed to run. Instead, they attack like an entire battle fleet. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, Kurita begins losing control of the situation. Smoke obscures targets. American air attacks appear larger than they really are. Destroyer torpedo attacks force constant maneuvering. Reports flood Japanese command channels. Enemy carriers everywhere. Possible fleet carriers nearby. American resistance far stronger than expected. Kurita starts fearing he has stumbled into a trap. If you find this kind of forgotten military history as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help us ensure they aren't forgotten. Then the battle becomes even more desperate. Gambier Bay finally loses power. Japanese shells continue hammering the carrier. Crewmen abandon stations engulfed in smoke and steam. The ship rolls slowly. Men jump into burning water slicked with oil. Nearby carriers continue launching aircraft almost continuously despite incoming fire. Some planes land without ammunition, refuel, take off again. One pilot attacks a cruiser by pretending he still has torpedoes. The Japanese ship turns violently to avoid an attack that does not exist. That single maneuver disrupts formation again. Every minute matters. Every distraction matters. Because Kurita's fleet should already be inside Leyte Gulf destroying troop transports. Instead, it is locked in a chaotic knife fight with ships never intended to see combat like this. And the Americans know something the Japanese do not. Their desperation is working. Johnston is dying now. Japanese shells tear through the hull repeatedly. Engines fail, speed collapses. Commander Evans, wounded and bleeding, continues directing fire from the exposed bridge. The destroyer fires until guns physically stop functioning. Sailors pass ammunition through smoke-filled compartments slick with blood and seawater. Then another shell smashes into the bridge. Evans disappears from sight. Johnston slows to a halt, still firing, still refusing to surrender. Finally, the crew abandons ship. Many never reach safety, but their attack helped save the carriers, and they were not alone. Hull sinks. Samuel B. Roberts sinks. Aircraft continue swarming Japanese ships from every direction. American pilots make impossible attacks simply to create confusion. One Avenger crewman later admits they were effectively throwing pebbles at battleships. Yet psychologically, the attacks are devastating. Kurita no longer understands what he is facing. Then comes the critical moment. Around 9:20 in the morning, after hours of brutal fighting, Kurita orders withdrawal. The most powerful Japanese surface fleet assembled in the Pacific turns away from tiny escort carriers and destroyers, not because it lacked firepower, but because confusion, aggression, smoke, air attacks, and relentless American resistance convinced Kurita he faced a larger threat than reality. The Japanese retreat northward. Leyte Gulf survives. The invasion survives, and one of the most astonishing underdog victories in naval history is complete. What they did not fully understand in those moments was how much had just changed. The battle off Samar becomes one of the defining moments of the Pacific War. Japan had one final opportunity to inflict catastrophic damage on the American invasion fleet in the Philippines, and it failed. Not because of overwhelming American firepower, but because a handful of escort carriers and escorts fought with such ferocity that they shattered Japanese confidence at the decisive moment. The strategic consequences ripple outward immediately. The Philippines campaign continues. Japanese naval power never truly recovers. Fuel shortages worsen. Experienced crews vanish. Major surface operations become increasingly impossible. And perhaps most importantly, Samar destroys the illusion that Japan can still seize initiative at sea. The Imperial Navy still possesses powerful ships, but power means nothing without momentum, without confidence, without trained crews willing to gamble everything again. For American naval commanders, the battle becomes legendary almost immediately, not because it was clean, not because it followed doctrine, but because ordinary sailors refused to collapse under impossible pressure. Historians still debate Kurita's withdrawal to this day. Some argue he could have destroyed the invasion fleet if he pressed forward. Others believe constant American attacks convinced him larger carrier groups were nearby, but everyone agrees on one thing. Taffy 3 should have died that morning. Instead, it survived. And the survival changed the war. Commander Ernest Evans receives the Medal of Honor posthumously. He becomes the first Native American in U.S. Navy history to earn it. Many of the men who fought at Samar return home carrying memories they rarely discuss. Burning ships, friends disappearing into smoke, the sound of shells landing closer and closer across open water, the knowledge that survival depended entirely on refusing to panic 1 second longer than the enemy. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague lives until 199 Sprague, but the battle off Samar follows him forever. To this day, naval historians study the engagement because it violated almost every conventional assumption about naval warfare. Smaller ships defeated larger ones psychologically. Aggression overcame firepower. Confusion defeated certainty. And courage altered strategy. Today, many people have never heard of Taffy 3. They know Midway, Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima. But not the tiny escort carriers that stood between the Japanese fleet and disaster in Leyte Gulf. That is why stories like this matter. Because history is not only shaped by famous leaders and giant battleships. Sometimes history turns because exhausted sailors aboard worthless ships refuse to quit. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state, and tell us if someone in your family served. Thank you for ensuring that Clifton Sprague, Ernest Evans, and the men of Taffy 3 do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.